I would like now to introduce today's presenters. Michael Jensen, Chief Research Officer, guides the practice's research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Ashwin Venkatesan, Vice President, leads Everest Group's practice focused on serving enterprises' IT leaders. Ashwin is responsible for developing Everest Group's research offerings focused on CIOs, CDOs, CTOs, CISOs, and IT strategy heads across application, cloud, and infrastructure, data, and security services. Akit Gupta, Practice Director, is a member of the IT services team and assists clients on horizontal technology topics such as automation, application services, and data and analytics. He is responsible for driving the published research for the practice, as well as delivering bespoke client-specific engagements. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Michael.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. Agile is certainly a hot topic. You think about agile everywhere. Who doesn't want to be agile? So if you go back to the history of agile, the Agile Manifesto was written about exactly 20 years ago. And today we wanted to do a check-in on how it's going. We wanted to delve into some of the practices. We wanted to talk about some of the things, give you some facts, and talk about some of the things that we see going right in the marketplace. So, it's certainly going to be a very important topic, especially as companies look to become more digitally enabled, and that's nothing new there. But anyway, what we wanted to do today is we're actually going to start with a quick poll and get your pulse of what you think you're doing right now with regards to Agile. So before we show you some data that we've already collected, let's go ahead and open up the poll there and ask the question as to what extent is Agile adoption happening in your organization? And so we'll leave it open here for about 10 seconds here, and go ahead and insert your votes. And okay, Ashwin, we'll close this in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ashwin, you and I were talking about what the likely answer is going to be, and it looks a little bit more optimistic than you were thinking. The good news on this call here is that we have nobody that has not introduced the Agile framework, so that's good. But if you look at where the bulk of the answers are, they are in that 20 to 40% range. Even the biggest answer set is that 40 to 60% range. Ashwin, tell me what you think about these.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Interesting results, Michael. I would say not entirely surprising. I would say kudos to folks in the audience. For many of these folks actually having matured their agile journeys, the 40 to 60%, this is in our view a good number. But as you rightly mentioned, right, I don't think there's any organization that's not thinking agile at this point in time. So it's just pretty heartening to see that enterprises are already starting to see the results that we believe they should be seeing, and then the fact that agile will and must get pervasive at the end of the day in years to come.
Yeah, and Ashwin, I think there might be a little bit of sample bias here too. The people that are interested in this topic are the ones showing up for this webinar. We're probably the ones that are a little further into their journeys. So, but with that, let's dive into some of the facts that you and your team have gathered.
Sure. So I think the numbers that we have on the left are pretty consistent with what we saw that the polls show as well, right? So as we said, agile everywhere. 9 in 10 companies that we speak to say that they've already started thinking of or adopting agile in one shape or form or the other, right? The question really becomes, what's the level of maturity that has been achieved? So while adoption becomes one part of it, the point is, are you starting to see the intended set of results and value that you expect from agile, even within the development teams that have been adopted, right? So Michael, that's where the data point on the right becomes very, very important.
Yeah, and so what do you want the audience to take away today? What are we going to?
Sure. So, yeah, thanks, Michael. That's so. I think it's no news for the audience as well. What we have been observing is that agile is not an easy journey, right? It's not an overnight exercise where enterprises turn agile. There are challenges, there are obstacles. It's going to be a journey that requires rigor at all times. We at Everest Group over the past several years, and especially over the last few months, have been helping observing a lot of enterprises and their agile journeys, and also helping a lot of them in terms of how to set up the right operating model, design, and get value out of their agile journeys. So what we wanted to do is take the learnings from all of these experiences and then share this with our audience over here. And then we hope that some of the messages and the best practices that we put forth will help enterprises accelerate that particular journey and moving towards that pervasive nirvana state, if you will, that I mentioned. So the one thing that I'll definitely say is, if you think about the journey of agile, that the most important thing is to internalize what truly agile is and then to live and breathe it. And this is where I'd also like to bring Ankit into the discussion.
Thanks, Ashwin. So, and I'll take the cue from the point that you mentioned in the previous slide around mature enterprises. So when we studied mature enterprises, one thing or one pattern that really stood out was not only that they understand agile, but they have percolated down into the execution teams. And what does that really mean? When we talk about agile in the true essence, it is not just about understanding what it is all about, but also understanding what it is not about. So as and when we have a conversation and conversation starter with respect to agile, everyone says it's about speed, time to market, but quality is really at the back of their mind or just disregarded at times. However, we believe that quality becomes all the more important when we talk about agile, when we talk about a software product in agile construct. The reason is twofold. One, it's not about the functionality of the module that you are really building. Now you have to also think about from a scalability standpoint, and also how it would be integrated with the follow-up modules down the line. So that's where quality becomes all the more important. And I must say, in advanced enterprises, if you really look at it, this is starting to gain a lot of momentum. Now you see quality managers being institutionalized at product level and also at the portfolio level. So when we talk about quality managers at those levels, they ensure that the overall quality standards which are set at an enterprise level are followed for each product. I'll just take another example for with respect to how the developers are really misusing agile, right? So everyone wants to really avoid documentation, and agile becomes one of the key things that they can really harp onto. And similarly, if they really want to operate in an ad hoc fashion, agile it is. But having said all of that, it is just to enable better business IT alignment. Nowhere we talk about avoiding documentation or operating ad hoc. It's a structured way of functioning.
So Ankat, when you're talking to your clients and they're having challenges, are the challenges focusing on this being an expectation problem? So like, is there expectations are just too big for what really can be realistic here, or is this an execution challenge?
So Michael, rather than picking one, I'll go ahead and say it's both of them, right? It starts with the expectation problem, like the one I was talking about from a QA standpoint, and it ends up being an executional problem. So for instance, the QA example that I was giving, if you really don't dedicate resources with respect to quality aspect of the product, you won't get the end result or the quality product, right? So it's the expectation problem being translated into the execution problem. That's how I'll put it.
All right, very good. And I have a brother that's a developer, and I think he's definitely in the avoid the documentation philosophy. So, all right. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take you through the current state of adoption. Then we're going to deal with some of the challenges, and then we'll talk about how to get this right. And so with that, Ashwin, get us started here on some of the facts that you have.
Yeah. So we talked about the 90% who are already thinking and starting to live and breathe agile. What we've seen is that COVID has, and then this entire pandemic has definitely been an inflection point in terms of Agile being thought of a great practice to becoming a de facto software development model, right? So if you look at the leftmost number, almost half of the enterprise that we're talking about have actually accelerated their programs towards Agile development. So it's not just about adoption, it's acceleration. And while they've done that, there has been an interesting realization that the delivery model disruption that has happened, right? So it has been by, I'd say by chance, that we are starting to work in a more hybrid model. We are starting to have teams which are located in different silos in some ways from a location standpoint. Interestingly, the concept of Agile has actually played into that particular concept. So for instance, when teams have been distributed across different locations, that has inherently given them an opportunity, and there's been a requirement for them to really step up and become more autonomous in some sense, right? And in some ways, that's the true genesis of Agile and the true philosophy of Agile anyway. So we are definitely convinced that Agile is the de facto for the future. COVID has provided that impetus to it. And consequently, if you look at the bottom, it's not just about adopting Agile. Almost 40% of the enterprises are saying that getting to that nirvana state where it's all pervasive, it's the core operating model is something that is panning out and not surprising anymore, right? If you look at the current state, obviously, there are certain silos within which Agile gets adopted, and that's where the 20, 30, 40% development teams come in. Ankit, I think you have some more data to unpack on that.
Yeah, thanks, Ashwin. So if we can really move to the next page, and it also reflects the kind of poll that we gathered. Somewhere around 50% is the majority, and that's where we see siloed adoption from an Agile perspective. Of course, there are three different methodologies or strategies that one can really go after, and rather multiple. The top three could be Scrum, Kanban, Safe, and everyone should mostly be familiar with all of those, right? However, as Ashwin pointed out, though it is becoming a de facto, there is still some ground to be covered to make it more real and have an enterprise-wide adoption across, let's say, 90 or 100% of the enterprises as going forward. Majority of enterprises, if we really look at it, as we were discussing, are really in the middle siloed zone. The kind of functions where Agile is gaining a lot of traction are essentially the front end customer facing applications, new product innovations, talking about digital technologies, IoT and AI and whatnot, where you are developing net new applications and you can really go ahead and adopt Agile in a full-fledged fashion, rather than the existing technology landscape where implementation of Agile would really need some transformation to make best use of it. That's how the current adoption scenario lies, Michael.
Okay, so now let's just break this down a little bit, because when there's a tendency when we do capability maturity models to focus in on, hey, everybody needs to move to the far right or the upper right or however the model's set up here. So when is it appropriate to be pushing for the most, and which organizations really kind of think they don't really need to be focusing on trying to drive to the most mature levels?
Yeah, Michael, spot on. In fact, that would be the one thing that we would be discussing in subsequent slides as well, that Agile is not a silver bullet, so that it could be applied anywhere and everywhere. It's like we see the e-commerce fintechs and the high-tech firms, digital native firms like Amazon, Google, Spotify, Netflix, kind of, who should be in the rightmost, the enterprise-wide Agile scaled BizOps kind of model, where you are really evolving fast and your competition is all focused on the software or the product that you are really developing, right? And that's where you need to be more responsive, and hence for those would be the best suited. Players like players in industries like BFSI, RCPG and others also have some legacy stack to work with, and there probably you need to take a more balanced approach of how you really need to move towards transformation and which projects you should and should not opt for Agile. And we'll talk about it in a subsequent slide where we lay out 5 elements which will help you decide which project should be agile focused vis-a-vis not.
Okay, great. So we'll get into some detail there. All right, so let's move the section on to some of the adoption challenges. And Ashwin, guess what's at the top of the list of challenges there? It's talent, talent, talent. That's all I hear today is, or today and every day is talent shortages and how do we deal with it? But it's at the top of your list as well.
Yeah. So if you look at agile practices and challenges, as you mentioned at the top, right, a lot of this is actually organization and culture, and there are a lot of elements that lie underneath. Interestingly, technology is not a concern anymore at this point in time. So we will be double clicking into talent because, you know, it's about the people, it's about the skills, it's about technical and non-technical aspects being brought together, and how do you find those unicorns who can you're going to drive that. But if you start looking at some of the other elements that you mentioned as well, Agile as a philosophy is fundamentally about breaking organizational barriers. You want to bring in capabilities from different functions which are put together and can start pulling through results in shorter sprints and in shorter time frames. Like that's the whole idea. Now, there has been a traditional way in which enterprise IT has been designed. We have had functions like development and testing and so on and so forth. And given these are huge scale functions themselves, it's not an easy job. So consequently, if you look at some of the themes that are mentioned over here, change resistance, change, training, there's been a way of doing things in large organizations, which fundamentally has been the biggest deterrent to adopting agile. Because now we are going to talk about, and there's one of the questions that has come up as well, right? It's not just about the development and software teams, development teams or testing teams. It's also about how do you align procurement, how do you align legal, and so on and so forth. The answer is collaboration at this point in time. And given this is an organizational-wide mandate, it has to be driven top-down. We'll get into some of the hacks later, but lack of senior management buy-in is a key challenge. The ability of individual teams to start thinking about the bigger picture and change the way in which they've been working in the past, that's a significant problem. And then Ankit talked about documentation at the end of the day, right? Agile requires different nature of practices, be it documentation, the way in which you collaborate, the kind of tools and processes you put across it. So it's organizational and culture, as I talked about. But Michael, yes, we've been tracking the talent theme for quite some time now. We have a lot of insights around that. That continues to be the biggest challenge that enterprises tell us when we think of agile.
Yeah, so let's give you some fresh data on that as well. So yes, we've been talking about it for a while, but it's getting worse, guys. We just did a poll here where we were talking to our clients about their increases in levels of attrition. And this data is like 2 weeks old, 2 weeks old. And so what we found here is looking at the attrition for all roles is actually up by about 10.5 points in the last 3 months. And so we've also looked at some other macro data in terms of job openings, and we looked at the needs and things. We don't expect this to drop down. So there's going to be a need for your organization to deal with this. And Ashwin, you're going to talk about a multi-process approach to thinking about this. It's not just going to be, well, just increase the compensation level, because it's going to be much more challenging than just driving that up.
Yes, Michael, and this is a foundational framework that we have been evangelizing and we believe in, right? So because the classical people process technology framework in our view doesn't hold merit in today's digital environment, you need to start looking at more granular elements. So if you think of the agile success model that we have put out over here, it needs to be designed by thinking through a combination of strategy elements and solution elements, right? Starting from the overall vision and how do you set the tone across the organization from a cultural perspective, from a design perspective, right? In terms of how the organization gets structured, how people get incentivized. The economics, we're going to talk about budget. It's about value measurement, right? If you start flowing down, how do you actually measure performance right? to ensure that you're getting the agile initiatives spot on becomes important. And as we move to the solution elements that kind of lie underneath, we're going to talk about talent, technology. There are a lot of options that are out there, but you need to ensure that it's standardized, it's consolidated. You don't want a proliferated environment. And down to sourcing as well, right? How do you contract? How do you incentivize some of your partners to drive agile along with you in a risk-sharing manner becomes important. And then how do you do this on a continuous basis also becomes very critical. So as I think of this framework, I can't think of a better discipline than agile, where all of these elements become very, very important. So as we have been applying this framework and then trying to understand enterprise journeys and helping enterprises on their journeys in agile, there are some common themes that have emerged in terms of where scaling challenges have really been emerged, right? So we have 4 such themes that we have identified, and then we're going to get into that.
Yeah, thanks, Ashwin. So talking about the first challenge, right? And no surprises, of course, considering technology is becoming ubiquitous. The topmost challenge, one of the strategy elements that Ashwin really talked about, the organization and cultural aspect, the mindset shift is one of the critical and the topmost challenge that enterprises are facing right now. Essentially, as we started off the conversation with, doing agile simply implies that you need to think and breathe agile. Then only it would be successful. Else, it's of no use. Western model is what we have highlighted over here that we use probably as a North Star when we talk about agile and how to make it successful. And as a typical trait in advanced enterprises, you will find that the generative culture, or more or less the performance-oriented culture, is where the shift is, rather than a rule-oriented or a power-oriented culture. And it has a reason behind it. So if we really look at the kind of work or projects that we do in agile or leveraging agile, are net new product innovation or net new technology innovation, right? And that's where you need not have a hierarchical thought process. Rather, you need to have an innovative problem solving skills. Similarly, the risks are to be shared rather than responsibilities are to be literally passing the ball kind of away from a developer team or business team to the technology team, and so on and so forth. So net to enable agile and the kind of projects that that you are really serving, generative culture works or fits best. In the next slide, we will really talk about the 5 key elements as we were discussing, right? In terms of not treating agile as a silver bullet, but understanding where agile fits in best. I talked about it to an extent in the previous slide, the novelty aspect of things, wherein if you are really building a net new product, you don't have experience or your team is not having enough experience, it makes sense to have an iterative approach. And that's where the middle element on the bottom half of the slide really comes through, the novelty aspect. Similarly, if we really talk about the other elements, the modularity part, we need to understand from a overall project dynamics standpoint, it's more around breaking a larger or gigantic project into smaller chunks. Consider a project like a data warehouse creation or a big data lake creation. You cannot define or break it into meaningful chunks that could derive value out of it. So that's where the modularity piece kicks in, where you can identify value in each of the module and really ensure that you are delivering in an agile fashion. Similarly, urgency, time to market becomes critical, and no-brainer, agile would be the best fit there. The last 2 are more or less some pieces that we have discussed in some way or the form. Stakeholder involvement when we talk about the business and IT alignment, and the talent profile. So this is a little trickier one, I'll say, because first you are talking about the cooperation part, but having said that, you cannot really have independent teams which are really one which is functioning in agile and other not functioning in agile. Else, the value added would be net zero, and that's where either both shift to the traditional mindset or both shift to the agile would make sense. So this is an overarching view how agile project alignment should be done, but from an execution standpoint, of course, we have talked about it enough in terms of talent. So Ashwin, why don't you talk about the challenges with respect to the talent that we are facing right now?
Yeah, and like Michael summarized upfront as well. It is a genuine challenge. You need people who can do agile right. But if we start looking under the hood, right, where does the challenge start to come in? So if you think of talent for agile, there are two aspects. There's the technical aspect, and then there's the soft skills or the broader set of characteristics that people need to have to drive that collaboration, business acumen, and so on and so forth. On the technical side, it's interesting, right? So one of our clients recently asked us, what is the primary skill that we need to pick to start building our full stack developers, right? The answer is that there is no primary skill for folks like full stack developers or a lot of people who are involved in agile anymore. It's a combination of skills at this point in time, right? It needs to be programming, it needs to be database, it needs to be automation skills. So it's almost like a composite set of expectations put together from a technical aspect. The non-technical aspect is even more interesting. If you start thinking of someone like a Scrum Master, previously a project manager would be primarily managing testers and developers. Now it is about orchestrating their efforts on a weekly basis, liaising with product managers to ensure that the requirements have been captured, the backlogs have been captured. At the same time, local Scrum Masters are almost have to double down and become product managers in certain cases to really help out teams. And if you think of broader product ownership roles, again, you're talking about working with almost all functions in the organization, right? From procurement, marketing, legal, and whatnot. So the profile itself is becoming so complicated. There are not a lot of people out there whom we can say that have been truly trained or experienced enough to drive these initiatives from the get-go. So consequently, a clear deterrent at this point in time. And the final key theme that has come out to be common is the way in which projects are managed from a funding perspective. We'll go into some of this in a little more detail, but if you look at the slide, there are two aspects. One, irrespective enterprises have a certain budget with which they need to operate. So the question becomes which product teams to fund, where do we put our value, and so on and so forth, right? At the same time, as you build products in an iterative manner, there are a lot of discoveries that happen in terms of new investments that are required, their scale features, and so on and so forth. So if you're stuck in a traditional mentality where it's annual funding cycles, you do not have a proper view of how to gauge value of software and ROI on top of them, you're going to see the third factor that we have placed on the right playing out, where CIOs are going to have certain budgets. Individual product teams are going to say that, hey, our product is the best and we require more investments. And that's going to get into a vicious cycle where there's a lot of heartburn and friction in the organization. So getting the funding model, potentially the fourth key thing that we need to start looking at.
All right, Ashwin. So I'm a finance guy by trade, and you scare me a little bit. And when I hear, hey, we're not going to take good financial discipline here, does Agile end up costing more? And how do we calibrate that cost, the benefit long term, so that folks like myself don't get too worried?
That's an excellent question, Michael. Theoretically, if Agile is done right, it shouldn't cost more for sure, right? So if you think of the two elements here, one, as I talked about in the previous slide, the talent that you require to drive this is going to be more sophisticated than traditional models. So it's going to cost you more. You're going to pay them and to get from the market. But there's going to be a countervailing factor over here, which is the true genesis of Agile being driving a lot of hyper automation and efficiencies across whatever we're doing. So what we're seeing is, in some ways, both of these cancel out. So when the process design is right, Agile should technically not cost more. But having said that, what we also advocate is we shouldn't be thinking of Agile purely from a cost or just a dollar perspective. At the end of the day, the end objective is about value to customers, value to internal teams. So it's a more broader ROI conversation where it's value upon cost. And that's where the true magic of Agile really starts to kick in at the end of the day. So if you put both of these cost and strategic levers put together and you get Agile right, the benefits can be truly multiple in almost, in fact, all the cases.
All right, so you say just trust me, okay? I got to believe first. All right, so let's talk about the benchmarks for this. And so we actually have an opportunity here for if you're interested and you're an enterprise in the and you're doing this and you're interested in some of the benchmarks along the way, some of the views of the marketplace in terms of the outsourcing vendors themselves. Go ahead and we're going to open up the poll and say, yes, I'm interested in more detail in the conversation with Ashwin. Please let us know and we'll be in touch with you from there. All right, we'll just close that out right now. Give it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so let's move on to our final section here, and we're really going to get into the how do we get agile right. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to open this up to you first, and then see what you're thinking right now. And in terms of the most significant challenges while you're scaling or adopting agile practices. So this is just select the thing that's most concerning to you. Is it the change management? Is it the skills and talent, leadership, support, technology, landscape, training, or metrics? Okay, this is turning out to be really interesting in terms of we're not seeing a runaway winner of this race. Starting to get a little bit of a lead here, but no, Ashwin. All right, we'll close this thing here in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ashwin, we had a photo finish here in terms, well, not quite a photo finish, but we have a close horse race, if you will. Go and blame it on the leadership, and sponsorship is the #1 answer. But I'd say for second place, we've got change management, best practices, and metrics here that are all in that #2 slot. Any thoughts there? I guess you made a comment earlier about the technology landscaping not being the deterrent here.
Yeah.
There?
So it ties back to the same thesis, Michael, that it's about org and culture at the end of the day, right? And given that the audience had mentioned that there's somewhere between 20 to 40% and 40 to 60%, it's very apparent that they're seeing the challenges that we see as well at the end of the day. I'm sure if we had put all of the above, we would have got an overwhelming answer saying all of the above. But net of it, yes, it's a mindset shift. It's not something that individual functions or individual teams can drive. It has to be a concerted effort, and the entire organization needs to be rallied around this. And that's where the vision and the impetus provided by leadership becomes truly important.
Okay, so let's move into we talked about doing how to get it right here, and the whole work from home, location specificity, the COVID, the hybrid model, all those things that kind of come into play in terms of, can you still do agile when we're all kind of around the world or we're not getting together? What are you hearing from clients?
It can be done. That's the short answer. And then the way this is being done is, so there are a couple of aspects over here. One, it's very important that to understand that in some ways now Agile is going to become a location agnostic theme, right? So we are starting to have lesser and lesser conversations on onshore versus offshore debates on where teams should be placed, etc. Michael, this is a point that you and I discussed. So it doesn't matter whether you're 50 miles or 500 miles away from your office, right? It doesn't matter anymore, but still we need to make this work. And fundamentally what's happening is we're starting to see a certain design where obviously there are certain roles like product owners and system architects who still need to be closer to the customer to try and understand their requirements. But then what we're seeing is there are self-aligning teams that focus on very specific work packets or modules or functions. Now, these can be located out of specific development hubs that a company might have, some satellite pods that have been set up in say, tier 2 locations. And then all of this is brought together through a very, very robust process and technology platform. The key here being that you provide the right autonomy and the right work description to each of these teams to operate in such a manner, right? So when organizations start, and then there are some hacks to this as well, right? You want to ensure that these feature teams consist of members who are familiar and you don't want to flip around teams. That becomes a huge talking point. So when you're able to keep teams consistent within these individual pods that I'm describing, it really helps drive that familiarity, drive productivity, and so on and so forth. But the model that we are describing on this chart and what I took you through is potentially what's going to play out, given that we are going to be hybrid for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I think if there's anything, COVID broke the dam on that particular issue about location. And you know, it seems to me that we're struggling to find talent in high-cost locations, and we might be able to find it in low-cost locations a little bit more freely or cheaply as well. But I think that's going to increase that level. People are going to reevaluate that decision again.
Yes, Michael, I would agree. Yes. So what do we believe some of the key hacks are in terms of getting agile right? So there are 5 key themes that we have identified. The first one is trying to simplify everything that's been done, right? So we do understand that agile teams are small teams who want to operate with their own level of autonomy. They want to use the technology stacks that they choose and so on and so forth. But at an organizational level, a platform can be built where there is a certain level of simplification of technology stacks, right? There's certain cloud stacks that you can choose to go on and so on and so forth. And also, how do you industrialize processes to ensure that you know, there's consistency in the way in which agile teams function. So that's one. It requires persistent teams, as I mentioned. So Ankit is going to talk a little bit more about that. But the point is, it has to be a team composition that does not change drastically over time. That becomes key. We need to shift right on talent. We dealt about this point, but there are certain questions around what has helped pushing the talent get the right productivity, right? So that's something that we're going to touch upon. And as you start thinking of working in this new model, it requires a different way of thinking, especially in terms of the metrics that you start using. And then how do you govern and drive some of this? How do you work with your service providers as well? And that's something that we'll also get into. And then finally, the funding part of it, right? So we mentioned that that's a key deterrent. We'll touch upon what are some of the agile funding practices that we are seeing best-in-class enterprises do. So let's get into this. Ankit, you want to touch upon the first two?
Sure, Ashwin. Thanks. So when we start off the conversation, right, as Ashwin highlighted, every team wants that their product or really talks about how different their product is and really cannot be encompassed by all the standardization that CIO office wants to drive. But Michael and others from the CIO office in the audience would get some respite viewing this particular page. The reason is twofold, right? One, of course, the technology standardization. There's a lot of technology sprawl that we see currently, and that needs to be standardized a little. So it could be done in a very simple fashion where you would identify similar tools and probably prioritize your usage with respect to one vis-a-vis other, so that there is certain level of standardization that the individual teams also cannot deny. And the second part is really the module definition, which really simplifies the overall cost estimation and effort tracking part, right? And that's where I was referring to the comment that Michael mentioned. How should I really measure the cost from any agile project? Because all of them say that they are different. There are two ways to do it within the module definition, of course. One is going the technology route, where you can assign simple modules with respect to, let's say, a CRUD operation or a login functionality or something similar, or an API creation. And second is, which is a much more preferred approach, rather the first in the particular page, is the business level functionality driven approach of this module definition. And that's where you talk about one functionality and standardize it and assign a relative effort and the cost associated to each of the functionality, which over a period of time could be a good book to really refer to when you start off a new engagement or a project. So net, both of these would really ensure that you have reusable components that can accelerate the delivery. Effort to standardization and better cost estimates would ensure better governance at an overarching level. Now, moving to the next page, we'll go ahead a little more deep in terms of how the teams are really structured, to the point that Ashwin mentioned. We are talking about the persistent product teams over here. And probably this also addresses one of the questions posted in the chat as well. If Agile is about smaller teams, how are you really talking about scaling Agile to an enterprise level? So if you have, let's say, 100 products across different business units, and each of them is aligned to a specific product team comprising of a core team and then an integrated DevOps factory. So there are certain technology people that you can loan in and loan out based on your scalability requirement, right? So, but the core team really remains consistent, and that is the multi-skill team, so to say, which really interacts with the business as well and understand the technology. It's essentially helping you to retain knowledge and ensuring better productivity, right? And if you combine all of this at all once, then you have Agile functioning at an enterprise level, because all of these small teams are really working in an Agile fashion. And once scaled up, your enterprise is moving in an Agile fashion. But the overall organization structure is this is what the organization structure should really look like at an enterprise level. So probably this really leads to the caveat in terms of the talent part, at least, to understand how we should really think about building the core team. And Ashwin, why don't you throw some light there?
Yeah, we did delve into the theme of talent, right? So the one thing I'll say is that it's about getting an accurate picture of the kind of skills that need to be thought about for different roles. And the second is, how do you action upon building those roles through the proper learning and upskilling and reskilling programs that you put in place, right? So we at Everest Group, we call this the skills passport in some way. So what you see on the right is what we see should be the ideal skilling path for a full stack developer. Now, again, there are a lot of nuances under this. You start thinking about this from a mean full stack developer standpoint to a MERN developer standpoint. But the key aspect here is to chart out what kind of roles that you have within the organization, what's the existing inventory of skills that you have, mapping out what need to be added to that to truly achieve the end roles that can truly have that multi-skilled capabilities to drive full stack development or whatever the function that we're talking about. The one thing that we also would mention here is this is just the technology view. There's a lot of emphasis and an enterprise do miss out on this point where you need to think about soft skills, right? It's about leadership, it's about collaboration, and so on and so forth, even business acumen, because you are working with customers, you're thinking about how the product is helping them. It has to be a holistic view, and you're not going to hire them from the market at the all time. And that's where we believe that enterprises need to start thinking of a parallel track where internal hiring is also becomes a supply channel for you on an ongoing basis. That's on the talent side. Yeah.
So Ashwin, we're back to that talent conversation again. I know you said you're helping clients with the skills passport, really trying to delve into how are you going to get these, who do you need, and some of the softer skills that go with the harder skills that bring success here. How is that working out with clients in terms of you working with them on that kind of project?
Yeah. So we do this based on almost 150 different roles and 800 different skills that we are tracking internally. It's turning out to be a very useful exercise for enterprises, right? So what we have seen is in certain cases, the definition of the skills has not been accurate in terms of what enterprises want to achieve. In certain cases, we have seen that there has been an underestimation in terms of the investments that are required to upskill, the kind of courses that need to be provided. There's a third angle to this, which is also not just about the skills, but project readiness at the end of the day, right? How do you put them in simulated situations to apply these skills and capabilities that they are acquiring? that is also becoming very, very important, right? So we definitely see enterprises see a lot of merit in undertaking this exercise. To the question on how enterprises have managed to get agile right in a distributed model, right? And especially with the COVID impact. So we call this the hierarchy of employee needs. And then what we're really seeing is that the focus on the higher order themes that we are talking over here, right? Which is independence, familiarity, empathy. These, in our view, become the biggest hacks in terms of getting teams productive at the end of the day. Yes, there are going to be a lot of your team members who are going to be situated in an isolated fashion, and it's going to continue at the end of the day. It's about how you can weave all those people into a seamless fabric and start getting them to collaborate, right? So 2 or 3 things. One, as I mentioned, it's about giving them a clear work packet or a set of features and functionalities that they can independently own, right? And giving them the autonomy to experiment and deliver on it. That's number one. When you're talking about bringing in new people into teams, the onboarding experience becomes very important. How do you transfer knowledge and documentation, right? How do you ensure that you're driving some of the software aspects in terms of team bonding exercises to have them feel comfortable? Keeping teams persistent so that we have this dual policy where there is a experienced buddy helping out a new team member on a consistent basis. That becomes very important. And then there's an overall morale aspect of it, right? You want enterprises, the enterprise to have its employees feel really connected. So it's also about creating social capital, helping people getting involved and seeing the broader purpose and vision of the organization. All of this becomes very important because as a developer, I want to understand how the functionality that I'm building is at the end of the day benefiting my organization and the end customer. So all of these elements need to be thought about to really make this model work. Yes, we have seen organizations get it right, even during this entire COVID disruption in some ways, and these are the elements that have really. Moving on. Ankit, you want to touch upon this?
Yeah, Ashwin. So we are talking about case study, which really encapsulates all what we have discussed so far. And one of the key challenges from the poll itself was the commitment from the seniors or executive stakeholders. The reason we are discussing this case study specifically is because it really covers 3 dimensions. One, the kind of commitment that you can get or strive for from senior or executive stakeholders. 2, how it was really transitioned from to a distributed agile mindset in a fairly quick fashion. And 3, the kind of impact that this generated, the overall exercise generated. So from the commitment standpoint, the organization or the executives were really aligned to ask anyone in the bank to really create a team which is geographically dispersed and initiate and work accordingly as they want to. And 2, of course, considering it as a cross-geography thing, it was more of a distributed agile model. And then the impact, which is on the right, is clearly outlined. The release time reduced from 20 days to 5, and the response feedback was really tremendous. So net-net, these would be the 3 key takeaways from this particular case study that I'll leave it for you. In the next slide, and probably that's where I'll probably address one of the questions that was out there in the chat as well. How do you really see the agile functioning for a run versus a change environment? Of course, I won't really drain this particular slide, but really hitting the 2 or 3 key aspects. One, from a value proposition standpoint, you need to understand what you are really eyeing from a run or a support function vis-a-vis a change function. The intent is to get savings right, hyper automation from and that's the key objective when you talk about support functions. Whereas from change standpoint, it is speed and hyper productivity. All of this objectives would really transition to the kind of supply model that you look at it and the kind of matrix that you look at. So I'll just pick one. The managed services construct would be a preferred supply model from a run standpoint vis-a-vis staff org, or probably a T&M for a change perspective. that's the key takeaway. You need to really differentiate between the two, and that's how one should really proceed.
Yeah, and over the last 2 to 3 years, at least, Ankit, we're starting to see that agile contracts for even supplies with agile being embedded starting to mature, right? So we are starting to see the right kind of at least the economic models in terms of per pod, fixed T&M, some of these being tried out and being adopted in the market. So mature enterprises are realizing that even service providers can't be treated the way they've been treated in the past. There needs to be transparency at both sides. There needs to be risk sharing, and that the commercial incentives need to be aligned for the speed, for the accountability that are expected from the supplier ecosystem.
Yeah, transparency is certainly the key, Ashwin.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then finally, to wrap this up, right, the funding model part of it. So a few approaches that we're starting to see. So it's very apparent that the annual budgeting cycle needs to be broken, and it needs to be done in a more agile fashion. So a few things that we're seeing, for instance, we are seeing quarterly budget reviews happening on a regular basis now than what used to be there in the past. We are starting to see zero-based budgeting. So all the assumptions that have been taken in the previous year are completely shelved. And based on the value that has been delivered by the product over the last calendar year, fresh budgets start getting allocated. So we see enterprises almost treat this as a product portfolio, which gets reviewed in a very, very frequent manner, where continuously product teams are challenged to show incremental value that a particular product is delivering. And if an MVP doesn't turn out and doesn't start showing value, the funds are automatically taken and then offered to other potential products, rather than waiting for the entire annual budget cycle to make some of those investments. That's becoming key. We're also seeing cases where a certain capacity level is invested for core products. And then based on the product performance, there are additional funding that are provided in a very ad hoc manner to support scaling of features and functionalities and so on and so forth. In certain cases where budgets are really tight, we also see enterprises tap into the broader sourcing ecosystem. Now, that these could be cloud service providers, these could be your services provider partners, or even some of the broader ecosystem participants who kind of bring in some funds. It's almost a joint core innovation kind of a model to kickstart the product development and then scale it from there, right? So net, breaking it down, having more frequent checks, and not locking in annual budgets and then making this a very monolithic exercise holds the key to achieving this agile funding design that we are describing. So just to summarize all of this, right? What we believe and what we urge the audience to think through as you want to move those numbers from 20 to 40, 40 to 60, standardization is important. There is a certain level of team autonomy that needs to be brought in. But the more you're able to standardize and the more you're able to bring things together in an industrialized fashion, that's going to give the ideal platform, right? And that's going to help you scale. We talked about the team composition part of it. It's very important that there are persistent teams which continuously learn and work together to drive the results that we are talking about, and they're familiar about working amongst themselves. That's number 2. Talent is key. We cannot harp on this enough. You need to start thinking beyond just the hiring mechanisms that you have and start building an internal talent pipeline for these initiatives. Working with the right transparency with the supplier ecosystem is going to be key. And then the agile funding model, of course, right? You need to rethink that the CFO, the CIO, and product owners all need to come together to really make this work.
All right, great, guys. If you're interested in dealing or going a little deeper with this topic with Ashwin and Ankat and the rest of our team, let us know and we'll be happy to do so. One of the things we wanted to do today was also introduce you to a study that we've opened up around the topic around IT workforce development. And it's in the format of a Pinnacle study. And what we do in a Pinnacle study is we compare enterprise to enterprise. So this is not a service provider comparison ranking of any sort. This is how one enterprise is doing against another enterprise. It's all held in confidentiality. We don't name names or anything like that. But we're looking for the outputs or the impacts compared to the capabilities, the cause and effect relationship there. So if you're interested in that, I believe it's going to be there in the chat for you to pick up on that study, and encourage you to take it, and then we'll give you back your specific results as we go forward here. Finally, I wanted to give Ashwin just a quick time just to answer the question of how are you helping your clients here, Ashwin?
Sure. So we have a deep understanding and a broad team that tracks all facets of IT services, including that spans across, right, the entire stack of IT, right from applications to infrastructure to data. And there are two broad ways in which we do this. So one, we obviously have a very intricate membership model where we have a lot of published research, we have data, and that's combined with analyst access, which is around the year. And the whole program from a membership standpoint is to help clients navigate to day-to-day issues and validate their thinking and keep picking up brains in an ongoing journey manner. And that's a baseline support that we offer from a membership standpoint. In cases where there are specific initiatives that are identified, specific strategic projects that have been identified within your organization, we provide bespoke research and insights through what we call as projects. Now, these can cut across a variety of themes, as you see on the right. We offer both models, and in certain cases, it's a combination of both that brings value to our clients. And this is alike for both the supply side of the market and the demand side of the market.
Okay, thank you, Ashwin. And I know you're doing a lot of work with clients that have that intersection between the talent issues of sourcing and skills and the realities of the marketplace with the benchmarking kind of data around the cost side of that. So I know you're doing a lot of work with clients on that. So, okay, all right. So we've been answering questions along the way, which has been good, but there are many others that we were not able to get to in this session. So what I'm going to do is ask Ashwin and Ankit to answer those questions one-to-one in the after we finish the webinar here today. And if there's something else that we didn't get to, feel free to reach out to them directly. But we are out of time. So I want to thank Ashwin and Ankit. And again, appreciate your participation. And if there's anything we can do for you, let us know.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone.